Hi, I'm Michael Chu, and in this presentation, I look at how photo voice or community storytelling can be stretched in a few ways, stretched from being looking at one particular site to looking at multiple cultures and countries, multiple sites, and also stretching forms of participation from the creating of those photos and stories to the dissemination and the viewing of those stories. How can participation be put in there as well? And I really looking at three particular shapes of engagement which emerge through this 5 year action research, looking at the frame, the spiral, and the hourglass, and how that can really, I guess, give pointers to us as educators around how we look at our projects. Let's dive in. So first, I just want to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Jara people, here also known as Castlemaine, and their sovereignty has never been ceded. And I also want to recognise the over 700 participants of this action research, because if it wasn't for their engagement, I wouldn't be here talking to you. So they're silent partners here in this presentation. So the question that this research was really looking at was how can this photo voice, and when I say photo voice, I really mean it's a method here which is essentially looking at training individuals or community members to use photography to tell their own stories as opposed to being represented, and how these stories can be sites of engagement beyond that community. So how can this sort of form of community participatory photography be adapted to help visualize and influence environmental engagement, so engaging with the environment, looking at positive future visions across multiple sites. So there's three particular research strands: the adaptation, the visualizing, and the influence that this research looks at. And I'll go through these really briefly in this presentation. So where was this? This was across three different countries: Australia, Bangladesh, and China. And they were chosen because they represented a huge diversity in terms of the economic so-called development levels, but also that environmental impact you can see here across these three countries. And this is how they represent geographically. There's the four sites here. And there's a big interest also in the material flows environmentally, again, that happen between these particular sites. And I'm also half Chinese, and I've worked in Bangladesh, so the relationships are really essential for this project. So looking at the methods themselves, how do we generate photographs? So I adapted the photo voice to be a particular concise workshop. So the first workshop would be really looking at what are some of the environmental concepts from the students, which could be primary, secondary, or tertiary, some of the storytelling or photographic concepts, and then they would generate some images or storyboards that they'd take into the second stage, which is the photography themselves, which they'd go about in their own neighborhoods. It's a very participant-driven process, taking a whole bunch of photographs. In the third stage, they'd come in, help them select the photographs, they'd write text and stories, and then they'd filter down to their most important story here. And in this process, there's lots of different adaptations of doing this. So it leads me to the first shape, which was looking at the frame, which is really, I guess, seeing, as us as educators, or myself in this project, what was my assumptions through doing these methods, but also the assumptions behind the photographs themselves. I like to sort of let some of them tell that story. So this one was one around environmental justice. These were participants from a secondary school in Melbourne, essentially looking at the caption basically said, plastic is bad in our environment. But when you juxtapose that with an image from Bangladesh, this person's talking about how if we put, in this case, spices in the non-plastic way, that should absorb toxins from the pollutants, industrial pollutants from the air, and we should actually wrap them in plastic to protect our environmental health. So it juxtaposes really those tensions and shows that environmental justice dimension to plastics. And again, thinking of how we can expand our ways of seeing beyond our current frames. The second example is from China, and this image and the text is basically saying that butterflies have compound eyes, multiple eyes, and this invitation, how can we see through the eyes of a butterfly as not non-human? And this little contraption is plastic straws to kind of give that that opportunity. And so I think it's a really powerful way of flipping the frame around to the human observer being observed by the non-human there, and looking at those differences in seeing and power relationships. So moving on to the second motif, the hourglass, which was really looking at the movement of photo stories from that generative workshop space here, through this narrow part, which is myself as the action researcher and the educator, to this part, which is really engaging audiences with viewing the stories themselves, and looking at how can we find this, get the participation, audience participation in this part as well as this part, and that tension between being the curator in this tiny little aspect here. So a couple of methods that useful. This was an interview-based method that I came across from traditionally in photovoice. You have exhibitions, but there can be quite a sort of narrow, shallow audience engagement with exhibitions. So this form was interviews, which essentially looked at training a whole bunch of volunteers that would engage with members of the public, in this case, an environmental festival. They'd pick out from a little deck of photographs, about 30 photographs, a photograph that strike their accord with them, and then be a dialogical process with that photograph, moving from some of the ideas, the thoughts, to the emotions, the feelings, and then in the end looking at actions that they would be inspired to take based on this picture. So there's a couple portraits that came out of it. There's the person that was picked the photograph, and their particular action here, like a more internal individual action, and this is more advocacy action, and these were actually taken back to the photographer in Bangladesh in this instance. So here again, looking at, I guess, the forms of participation in that sharing of those stories. This is another example looking at action projects. So this actually started with community mapping, looking at individuals. This is in Dhaka, their relationship to space, their hopes and dreams in a spatial way. They then generated photo stories using those photographic workshop techniques. But then there was also a sort of a mentoring process to work with the individual participants in groups to generate community-orientated projects that could then have an outcome, a community outcome. So some of these were tree planting projects, or cleaning up the streets projects. So really looking at that bridge between individual storytelling, spatialized storytelling, into more collective forms of action there. And then looking at the potential of how could we do this across multiple sites. So the spiral itself was the third and last motif, which was really looking at participatory action research. That's really looking at the prototyping, evaluating, and moving forward with it. But in this case, I really saw it as a notion of a sort of a sense of trust and surrender, because as if this vertical aspect is one's goals in the project, often I was moving kind of sideways to it, but in a sense it was only through repeatedly spiraling around that I could actually end up with generating some of the outcomes here. And this is sort of an example, a schematic of there was only 90 different engagement activities across these 3 research strands. Each of these circles had multiple sort of workshops, engagement within them, the exhibitions, interviews, so forth. So in a sense, they were all different forms of spirals and experiments that happened within. So much of that was around the engagement motif. So we had the storytelling from the participants and the mentors that supported them here in producing those stories and that kind of thing. But also there was sort of more behind the scenes of the capacity building and the resourcing side. So there's a dozen interns that helped around this and sharing of the project, and the crowdfunding. There was over 100 supporters that financially chipped in as well. So many different pathways of engagement for this project. So some of the key learnings in the photo voice creation side of the hourglass, the top end was the importance of relationships, co-designing, and that embodied aspect and the materially grounded aspect of the workshops, physicality that was really important for participation. And then the dissemination influence part. Like I said, exhibitions were quite broad, but the interviews gave a depth to it. The projects was the link between the storying to the collective action interactions, and all affirmed, the importance of visuality to environmental caring across the thinking, the feeling, the acting registers, and how empathy could be used for cross-borders engagement. So I just want to end with an invitation on how you might use some of these participatory storytelling methods in your own projects. I'd like to be in touch. Thank you very much.